Hello there. Um, my name's Kris Darby. I am a senior lecturer in drama and performance at Liverpool Hope. And I'd just like to say thank you to the conference organisers for giving me the opportunity to speak. So as a researcher, my focus is on walking as an aesthetic practice. And over the last few years, I have become particularly interested in walking simulators, which I argue is one of the most haunted genres in video gaming. I've looked at walking simulators through the prism of hauntology a number of times previously, and in this paper today, I would like to develop this further by exploring how mourning is facilitated in games of this type. My case study is Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, an open-world bright horror created by the Chinese Room in 2015. In it, the player wanders through a Shropshire village in 1984, in which all of the occupants have vanished. There are roadblocks preventing you from leaving, abandoned vehicles, posters detailing an influenza virus. As you walk, you trigger echoes of its past, in which you witness small conversations between characters that feed you some of the story. These echoes occur as illuminated outlines who are unaware of your presence. I stand next to Wendy Boyles, who is an elderly widow and for some, a bit of a busybody, who is God-fearing and who has made it clear that they dislike the changes happening to the village. Now, obviously, I can't describe what they look like in detail, but I picture them looking a lot like my great-grandma Ida for some strange reason. Now, Wendy's had quite a day, trekking through the village, collecting the dead birds that have mysteriously dropped from the sky, whilst looking for their astrophysicist son, Stephen, who works at the local observatory. She is now looking upwards at the planes flying over, believing it to be the government coming to save them all. She calls to Steve as if he is there, saying that it's just like when her late husband Eddie came home from the war. She freezes, her arm outstretched, gesturing to the planes, and then slowly dissipates into small particles of light. Now, this was the 7th time that I've seen Wendy die, but it was the first time that it really affected me. Like many people, I lost 2 grandparents during the pandemic and was unable to be with them in their last moments. The character of Wendy reminded me a lot of my dear Nan, Sylvia, in parts, and with her affectionate references to her husband Eddie being akin to that of my granddad, Malcolm. Being able to stand this close to Wendy in their last moments in a manner that I couldn't do with my 2 grandparents, when they're all alone at the end of their life, was a beautiful privilege that I'd never really appreciated before, and I was genuinely surprised at how affecting it was. In their publication, The New Black, Mourning, Melancholia and Depression, Darian Leader argues that the arts act as a set of instruments to help us mourn. Mourning the loss of fictional characters or worlds enables us to process our own sense of loss. Video games, as Sabine Hara writes in their seminal text, Games and Bereavement, are the medium of loss and death. In this publication, they discuss a number of instances of loss, including from titles such as Final Fantasy VII and Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons. Whilst the arts, in general, offer a broad range of different modalities for exploring grief, Hara draws attention to interactivity as a particular and distinctive quality of video game. Often in walking simulators, I believe that the loss and death Hara discusses are more pronounced, given that the cycle between them is not so much geared towards the player being better at playing, but is a starting point for their experience. However, ironically, the premise of games like Rapture means that as players, we have to understand the significance of a loss that isn't ours. And initially, we have to come to terms with who or what has been lost, how it happened, and what this means to us as players. The mourning process is not a given. It takes time. Now, a first-time player could feasibly perceive Rapture as a mystery to be solved, and after completing it, they may never play it again. We could think of it as what site-specific performance makers and scholars, Mike Pearson and Cliff McLucas, refer to as the scene of crime, in which the performer imagines a possible performance based on the clues available for an adoption of what they call a forensic attitude. The lure of walking simulators is in part due to the opportunity to play detective with this forensic attitude, safe in the knowledge that there is little or no possibility of being threatened or waylaid in their pursuit. In this paper, I want to discuss how replaying Rapture provides a means to transition from this detective-like playing of the game to something that could be conceived as a space for mourning. However, as I will discuss later, such a transition is not a one-way street, and that the player can find themselves shifting quite easily back and forth in a desire to discover new representations of those lost. Now, there are obviously a myriad of different reasons for why one may want to return to a game of this sort. For instance, to find all the fragments of story you missed, or indeed just to collect all the trophies. Robin Sloan talks about the pull of nostalgia in Rapture, highlighting how the environmental design harkens back to the paintings of Turner and Constable in capturing an idyllic pastoral landscape that perhaps never existed. This world is indeed a very inviting one, perhaps also appealing to the notion of the tourist gaze, articulated by John Urry. Nevertheless, I argue that the replayability of any game invariably makes it ontological. In The Spectres of Marx, Jacques Derrida presents his conception of hauntology, which, broadly speaking, concerns a study of how ghosts of the past and future manifest within the present, becoming unresolved ruptures. As a consequence, time is out of joint. Christine McCrea presents a really considered discussion of hauntology in video gaming, in particular drawing attention to how the medium is haunted and interrupted by other media and genres. Indeed, Rapture is very much a good example of this, with the developers acknowledging the influences of the cozy catastrophe novels of the 1960s and 70s, as well as films such as Stalker and Metro. One aspect of Derrida's writing on hauntology that does not appear to have been as prominently discussed within video game studies is their perception of mourning, which they characterize as the desire to ontologize remains. To mourn, we first have to identify the bodily remains and localize the dead. Nothing could be worse for the work of mourning than confusion or doubt. One has to know who is buried where, and it is necessary to know to make certain that in what remains of them, they remain there. Let them stay there and move no more. This is similar to what Jacques Lacan refers to as a constitution of the object, and interestingly, the core activity of Rapture concerns localizing the dead. As I walk around, I locate small flecks of light which I can interact with, and then witness a moment, or moments, or even the final moments of a character. Yet once the moment is gone, I cannot replay it without restarting the game, and there are no bodily remains to speak of. Unlike other walking simulators like Return of the Obra Dinn, I don't have the capacity to log this within the game either. Only I know where they died, and I have to remember it myself. Now immediately then, a paradox of sorts presents itself when discussing mourning in relation to Rapture. Before I can come to terms emotionally with loss, I have to have had the thing lost in the first place. What starts as an absence has to be perceived as a loss. This takes time, and in the case of Rapture, it requires replays of the game in order for me to internally, at least, localize the dead. Furthermore, although I have grown attached to the population of the village, my attachment is ultimately to their ghosts, or the spectral echo of their past. I never knew them, and when they were I never knew them when they were living. Each scene I trigger begins with the dead returning. I don't even have any photographs or images of the villagers. As I walk around their homes, all I see are empty photo frames and albums. In fact, the developers confirmed that no concept art was ever created for the characters. They exist only as ghosts, or as Justinian Yannick terms, memory disks. Now, this hasn't stopped players imagining, reaching beyond the confines of the game to make the past the present. I can never interact with these characters. I can walk into their homes and build up an internalized picture of what they would have been like, but ultimately, I'm not mourning their loss, but of the relationship I could have had with them, if they were still living. This is why I find Derrida's conception of mourning so fascinating, because it offers the possibility of finding a way through paradoxes such as those presented by Rapture. The close overlap between playing detective and mourner is reflected in the game environment as well. The village is divided into 6 sections, with each underpinned by a specific character. Once all of the memories in a particular area are triggered, a visual or auditory cue directs the player to a specific location in this section. The multi-cursal pathways of the village within each section enable me to engage in a critical part of the mourning process, that of being able to reshuffle memories of those lost in a bid to locate new representations of them. Although a few memories are unavoidably triggered by my movements, most of the time I can choose the order in which I access these representations of the dead. Tom Turner, studio manager at Chinese Room, confirmed that they wanted players of Rapture to craft their own story and their own experience in the game world at their own pace and in an order that makes sense to them as they're exploring. In instances, this creates the temporary illusion that I've discovered a part of the game map that I've never been to before. Given the maze-like design of the environment, it is not uncommon for me to miss certain moments in one playthrough and not encounter them until much later in another playthrough. Once triggered, I can walk freely next to the characters, choosing to witness these memories from wherever I choose and to make each replay feel different. For Sigmund Freud, this reshuffling was crucial in allowing the mourner to revisit the same memory from a different perspective, to judge that it is lost, and to keep doing this until the process exhausts itself. Darien leader queries to what extent this is viable. For instance, what is to prevent this exhausted repetition going on indefinitely? They suggest the motif of the frame as a useful addition in which we draw attention to the artificial nature of what we see. From my own perspective, there is a latent theatricality inherent within this through the creation of a representational space that we look into and the boundaries of which we can walk across. The fact that the landscape of Rapture is framed off and sectioned means that these scenes of crime have the potential to become memorials to mourn within. The gaps between the memories of the villagers, both spatial and temporal, provide necessary spaces for the mourner to infer and insert their own order of events that will invariably change our perception of the narrative. Co-director of Rapture, Dan Pinchbeck, talks about the importance of absence as a story architecture, in which ambiguity, the enemy of Derrida's conception of mourning, is crucial. This echoes Freud, in which we conserve the object lost in order to make sense of its ambiguities as part of the process of mourning. In my initial playthrough of the game, these connections largely concerned trying to determine a correct order of events and a cause for the event that led to the disappearance of the villagers. Over time, my connecting has concerned the relationships between the characters themselves and myself. In this way, these gaps become evocative spaces, as Henry Jenkins terms them, providing space for us to imagine, and in doing so, knit ourselves into the lives of these characters, to create our own memories with them. With the game providing a space to mourn for its use of framing and reshuffling, the manner in which I walk in Rapture has changed to suit this. The sprint button is now used very sparingly, and I find that my movements are less about scouring the landscape than intending to it. The more I retread the landscape of Rapture, revisiting the ghosts of its occupants, the more I feel a part of a ritualized process of mourning, bearing witness to those without remains. I'm also haunted by my own memory of playing it before, almost like the ghost car one experiences in racing games. In some instances, I will settle into the groove and happily retrace my steps, but in others, I will deliberately choose a different route in order to provide a different perspective, creating a ghost of myself to haunt my future playthrough of the game. What started as a maze in my detective-like desire to solve a mystery has grown more labyrinthine as I've cultivated my own routine walking route or point narrative that I feel does justice to the people of the village. Sam McIlhinney argues that this shift from the spatial topography of the maze to the labyrinth occurs every day as we get to know a place. But this is not a one-way street. The fact that Rapture can provide me with the opportunity to reshuffle memories still keeps the morning alive and denies any sense of exhaustion just yet. A good example of this is in the section of the map devoted to the character of Frank, which takes place in lush golden farmland in the process of being harvested. I know that Frank's life and this section of the game will end at the windmill atop the hill, so I deliberately avoid that part of the map. I trace a linear route, ensuring I don't double back on myself as I re-experience the different memories within the landscape. These different memories here now become akin to the Stations of the Cross, which in Western Christian churches form a processional route that symbolizes the route Jesus Christ was supposed to have walked to Mount Calvary in their final days. In fact, in some cathedrals, labyrinths were and are still used to symbolize such a walk, in what Rebecca Solnit refers to as compressed pilgrimages. Similarly, as I walk, I imagine Frank making such a journey, the small vignettes giving me space to imagine what occurred between them. I follow my pilgrimage through Frank's fields until I hear the sign, an air raid siren. I then make the final, inevitable journey up the hill to see a magnificent view of the fields below, before, again, I witness Frank's death. However, although my descriptions here suggest a very neat and ordered linear process, the reality is often not the case. Despite watching Frank die again, I know that this will not be the last time I encounter him in this playthrough. For instance, I will see him have an altercation with his nephew Stephen about a mile away from here. Complicating this also is that the more I play Rapture, the more the lives of secondary characters become even more present. Consequently, I'm at different stages of the mourning process with different characters, due to different degrees of attachment. Given that in order to mourn, as Leader asserts, each memory and expectation linked to that person we have lost must be revived and met with the judgment that they are gone forever, I really won't be able to fully mourn the characters in Rapture until I've done this with its 6 major characters and 24 minor characters. However, this isn't to say that mourning can be completed, more that from a Lacanian perspective, we further understand our new relationship with what has been lost. Therefore, we could conceive of this perhaps unending process of mourning as a continuum that the player moves through, if they so choose, to emotionally attach themselves to what has been lost. Building on Espen Arsef, Ryan et al. Propose what they term 2 contrasting relations to space that play a major role in shaping narrative content: strategic space and emotional space. I find them very applicable when discussing the delineation between the detective and the mourner. Conceiving of the world of Rapture as a strategic space is to see it as something to be solved, whereas to view it as a space shaped by and charged of emotions, it becomes then something to be resolved or resolved. Now, I want to stress that I'm not proposing a binary here. Indeed, these perspectives are heavily interrelated with each other. For example, as I've already mentioned, the separating of the village into different sections enables both a systematic treading of the environment, but also facilitates the process of framing important in the mourning process. Also, reshuffling is useful for the detective in exploring other alternative solutions, but it is also imperative for the mourner in being able to understand and process their loss. The example of mourning I've discussed here today is that of an individual process, perhaps indicative of Rapture, like many walking simulators, being a single-player experience. This paper, like the countless other forums and artistic practice relating to Rapture, acts as a means to authenticate our experiences, reflecting the importance of others within the mourning process. I actually have a picture of the mourning tree in Frank's field on my wall that I took in-game. A symbol of reverence for the game, but also another frame, Each time I look at it, I reshuffle my different experiences of the game that I have played. A gentle haunting of what was and could be. Thank you very much.